Salam everybody! So I just want to say thank you so much for all of the support that I received in like the last video. I can't believe that the channel was able to reach like 140 subscribers. Like, I literally can't believe that. I'm so very thankful for that, and I also appreciate everybody like leaving comments and liking that video. I really appreciate it. I mean, I just did it because I just felt like more people should know about what is going on in Afghanistan and how the Kite Runner, you know, might have more harsh implications and things like that. So I really appreciate it. So yeah, thank you so much for all of your support and everything. I truly appreciate it. So for this video, I wanted to talk a little bit about Khaled Hosseini's other famous work, and that is 1,000 Splendid Suns, and give my review on it and talk a little bit about why 1,000 Splendid Suns is a little bit better than the Kite Runner, but is also problematic in some aspects of it, and I wanted to talk about it. So let's get into it. Anyways, let's talk about 1,000 Splendid Suns. So 1,000 Splendid Suns is a book that I remember reading when I was in high school, and I remember when I first read that book, I remember there were tears in my eyes, and I remember how I cried for the Kite Runner as a high schooler, but for 1,000 Splendid Suns, I remember I was sobbing, and I was in the school's library, and I remember I would take my hijab and like try to wipe my tears off because I couldn't stop crying because it felt so beautiful. And I remember remembering quotes from the book and like seeing quotes from the book all over the internet, like this very famous quote that I'm sure everybody knows of how she's the Noor of my eyes and Sultan of my heart. All of that quickly became overshadowed when I recently reread the book as a 24-year-old and as somebody who has read Orientalism by Edward Said and many other books that kind of talk about books that were written in a post 9/11 world. I quickly realized that once again, similar to the Kite Runner, one of my favorite books of 1,000 Splendid Suns became disingenuous and problematic. Because similar to the Kite Runner, 1,000 Splendid Suns is just another propaganda piece to justify US intervention in Afghanistan. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. So, due to being written to a white liberal audience, similar to the Kite Runner, the book uses orientalist and Islamophobic syntax, where there is no distinction between fundamentalism and normal Islam. So, for example, when Maryam had been forced to marry Jalil, he then proceeded to R-word her and mentioned how it is what the Prophet himself and his wives did. A very common misconception that exists between non-Muslims about Islam is that women are supposed to obey their husbands and do whatever they want, and that the Prophet was already existed between non-Muslims about Islam at the time. And what Hosseini does with that line is that he is utilizing it to paint this anti-Islam narrative. Okay, and this is once again mentioned in Peter Moray, where he says that these are known as Muslim misery memoirs, and they depict Islam as a source of oppression. So, as going off of that, well, me and you, if you happen to be Muslim, we would recognize that that line that was said by Rashid is not something that is in the religion, and is not something that we are told in Islam, and is not something that our Prophet has ever mentioned or has done. For somebody who is white and liberal idea about Islam, they would read that line and they would be like, oh wow, the Prophet was like this. I guess it's, you know, it's reaffirming those stereotypes they might have already had about the Prophet and Islam and Muslims in general. Once again, Khaled Hosseini is basically pushing this trope of how fundamentalist Islam is equivalent to normal Islam by that line. And it's very easy to say that Rashid is a basically problematic character and he like is supposed to be that way, but Hosseini is subtly using, you know, a problematic character to push this narrative. As we go further in the story, we see very overt US imperialist lines and all that. On that note, the book basically paints US imperialism in a positive light, similar to the Kite Runner. And there are some not so subtle examples of it. For example, The ending, similar to the ending of the Kite Runner, the situation in Afghanistan and 1,000 Splendid Suns is concluded with this, with Tariq saying, "It may have not been a bad thing that Bush would be going into Afghanistan and that maybe there will be hope when Bush's bombs stop falling." The insinuation that Bush going into a country would bring peace into a land is the grossest misrepresentation ever. According to the Human Cost of War, over 180,000 casualties were a result of the Afghan war, and over 40,000 of them were civilians. There was no peace or justice that was brought from the dropping of those bombs, and women did not become more free. And instead, women in those rural areas of Afghanistan were actually more likely to be killed by those bombs, widowed, and to be R-worded by soldiers. Once again mentioned by Peter Moray, there is this overarching message of rescue by the West. However, as statistics have shown, and by talking to people who have lived through the war in Afghanistan, there was no rescue by the West. It was only pain and suffering, as you can see by the casualties. It is painting basically US imperialism in a positive light, and that is not okay. Now, on the other end of things, unlike the Kite Runner, the book actually mentions some historical and cultural aspects of Afghan culture and history. Also, I apologize. I keep looking at the essay I wrote about this because I feel like I can say everything more coherently and all of that, so I apologize if I stop looking at the camera and occasionally looking at this. But if you, once again, similar to the Kite Runner, if you want to get like a better version of this where everything is written and there's evidence of everything, you can just read my blog. Unlike the Kite Runner, so on that note, we're talking about that, there are some aspects that are wrong and never mentioned. So in the beginning chapters, we have Maryam talking to Nana and how she mentions how a man's accusing finger always finds a woman. So in most cultures, women are always the most vulnerable, and it is especially true for women who live in Afghanistan and continue to live there. Afghan women continue to not have the rights that they deserve in the country and are disproportionately more likely to die than men in the country. This book also has positive narratives because, you know, we have the mullah who was talking to Maryam and saying how God could not let all this fortune slip away. In moments like these, we see religion being painted in a positive light. However, that is all very much overshadowed because of the pro-US intervention stance of the book. Because the insinuation that bombs would bring peace and rights and justice to women is disgusting and has never been true. Instead, it only brings bloodshed and pain. So while Hosseini mentions a lot more historical events that were accurate, such as the CIA funneling money and the USSR invasion and how it actually brought about good aspects of it, it didn't just paint it in negative like as it did in the Kite Runner, there are some things that it never really mentioned that it should have mentioned, and that is Pakistan's involvement in the land. Because according to Patterson, the only reason the Taliban had succeeded their takeover in 2001 was because of the military support of Pakistan and Saudi Arabia. But in the book, Pakistan is always shown positively because it was a pastoral refuge for Tariq. So that is kind of the analysis of its historical background and whether it was positive. But once again, all of that is overshadowed by the fact that it is a propaganda piece for US intervention. And on that note, once again, it's really easy to write off this book and the Kite Runner as a work of fiction. How Khaled Hosseini has, as a work of fiction, he can write whatever he wants and it is okay if it's wrong or right. It's important to, although, you can say that, but it is important to remember that books that were written in this time period, similar to the Kite Runner and other books like Reading Lolita and Tehran and many others, they were written for one purpose, and that one purpose is to sway the public's opinion about those said countries. And a lot of these books have very orientalist and Islamophobic language in them, as I mentioned earlier. So Khaled Hosseini is known as the West's favorite Afghan and is considered a native informant of the country. And this is something that is crucial for the self-justification of neoliberalism and is dangerous with harsh consequences, as mentioned by Moray. For example, in a speech by Laura Bush, she mentions how fighting against terrorism is also fighting for women. This is a disgusting conflation because bombing a country does not bring women's rights. As I mentioned in the blog post about Kite Runner, Khaled Hosseini published this book 6 years after the invasion of Afghanistan, and books by authors who, in these books that were written about the Middle East or that region of war, are always basically salvation in the West and play a crucial and less obvious role in US politics. And this is mentioned by Mara. And that's why it's very important to do more research about it. While people were getting bombed, Afghan people were getting bombed in Afghanistan, Khaled Hosseini was eating dinners with the Bush family and was very close. And I mentioned this in the other video, but honestly, I'm not gonna enjoy a book where the author was eating dinners with the man that was indiscriminately killing Afghan people and had over 200,000 casualties and over 40,000 civilian deaths. So that is my review over 1,000 Splendid Suns. It is a bit shorter than my review over the Kite Runner, but nonetheless, in conclusion, I could not enjoy 1,000 Splendid Suns because of the author's background and the context in which it was written as a propaganda piece, the orientalist and Islamophobic choices that it had made in the book, and most of all, and most importantly, its very weird overarching message that US imperialism and US intervention in the country would bring about women's rights and is good. And that is all something that never occurred and is fiction, and it is important to keep all that in mind because a lot of people don't know about Afghanistan, and what they do know is about the Kite Runner and 1,000 Splendid Suns, and that is inaccurate. So that is my review of 1,000 Splendid Suns. So it is a bit better than the Kite Runner, but again, it is not something I enjoyed because of the author and because of the context and everything, and because of its overarching message of US intervention. So that is my review. I hope you all enjoyed this. And yeah, so truly appreciate for all the support that I've been getting. I really appreciate it. So, and I love reading your comments, and I love people engaging with everything. I'm also on TikTok and Instagram. My Instagram is private, but I'll accept you and I'll follow back. But yeah, so that is everything. I love you all so much, and stay beautiful, stay kind, and yeah, so bye, assalamualaikum.